Welcome to another deep dive. Today we're going to be tackling, a topic that's been kind of all over the news lately, the rise of the far right. And you sent over some really interesting material on how leaders, specifically in Brazil, Italy, and the U.S., rose to power. And that paper, The Silent Takeover of Power by the Far Right, that was a really fascinating read. Are you ready to get into it and maybe uncover some surprising insights?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay, great. So the paper highlights this pretty significant swing, global swing actually, towards the far right within, what, just a decade. And they use Brazil, Italy, and the U.S. as kind of prime examples. One thing that really struck me was how each of these leaders used, well, really strikingly similar slogans. I mean, you've got America first, Brazil, beloved nation, and Italians first.
Yeah.
It feels like, I don't know, it feels like more than just a coincidence, you know?
Yeah, no, I think you're right to pick up on that. Those slogans, they definitely point to a much deeper shift. I mean, on the surface, they promote, sure, national pride and all that. But I mean, they actually signal a real move away from global cooperation and towards policies that are much more inward focused. The paper, it argues that these leaders really tapped into this growing sense of us versus them, which ends up creating a sense of division
Oh.
on the world stage.
Yeah, and it's also fascinating that the paper says that a lot of people didn't really see these leaders coming. They were considered outsiders,
Yeah.
almost dismissed by, the political establishment at the time.
Yeah.
Why do you think that was?
Well, that's a key point that the paper brings up. It argues that, this underestimation, it was a major blunder by opposing political forces. Basically, they just failed to grasp the appeal of these figures and really just how deep the discontent they were channeling actually ran. A perfect example is Trump's victory back in 2016. I mean, it caught so many people off guard. And Bolsonaro, too, even though he had spent years in Congress. He initially lacked any real credibility, at least within those, traditional political circles. Yet both of them managed to connect with voters in a way that established politicians just didn't.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Now, the paper draws a comparison to Obama's very successful use of the internet back in 2008. But it suggests that these far-right leaders kind of took that idea and amplified it or maybe weaponized it even. So how did they use social media differently?
Well, the paper really digs into specific examples of how social media was used, I guess you could say weaponized. I mean, take Bolsonaro, for example. He strategically built this massive following on WhatsApp. And by doing that, he was able to bypass those traditional media outlets and, by spreading these very targeted messages and really forging a direct connection with voters, he was able to control the narrative and kind of get around that scrutiny you usually get from the established news.
So it wasn't just about being on social media. It was about being smart and strategic and using it to bypass all the traditional gatekeepers.
Exactly, and to connect with voters directly on this really emotional level.
Yeah. Now, the paper also makes the argument that these really, kind of complex global events, things like the financial crisis of 2008, mass immigration and craze, all this economic uncertainty that was going on, that really created, fertile ground for these leaders and for their messages to resonate with voters. How did they capitalize on those anxieties, do you think?
Well, I think it's really important to remember the world was in a state of flux. The financial crisis had shaken a lot of people's faith in the global economic system. And mass immigration and displacement, which was fueled by conflicts and climate change, it really created anxieties about national identity and cultural change. And I think these leaders, whether they had better solutions or not, they were really good at articulating those anxieties. And they offered these simple solutions, often, nationalistic solutions, that really appealed to people who felt, overwhelmed and disillusioned by just how complex everything was.
So it sounds like they weren't necessarily offering better policies, but they were just better at speaking to the emotions and the anxieties of that moment.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. They tapped into this deep sense of unease that a lot of people were feeling, and they offered this sense of security and belonging in a world that just felt, increasingly uncertain.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really interesting way to look at it.
Yeah, I think so. And that kind of leads us to what the paper calls the consequences of this global shift. It argues that the rise of the far right is really creating this more divided world where international cooperation kind of takes a backseat to national interests.
Yeah, when I read that, I couldn't help but think, are we heading toward a world where every nation is just focused on themselves and there's, very little regard for the global challenges that we're all facing? Is that what the paper suggests?
Yeah, in a way, I think so. The paper is really concerned about this rise of what it calls competitive nationalism. Basically, the idea that instead of countries working together to tackle issues like, climate change or poverty or pandemics, they're increasingly turning inward.
Mm.
And they're prioritizing their own interests above any kind of collective action.
That's a pretty sobering thought. I mean, the paper even uses the phrase walls, both literal and metaphorical, to describe this trend. It seems like we're moving away from a world where there's shared responsibility and towards one that's a lot more isolationist.
Yeah, and I think you're right to point that out. The paper argues that the shift is driven by that us versus them mentality that you were talking about earlier. It creates a climate where cooperation is seen as a weakness and global engagement is viewed with suspicion. And that has real world consequences. Think about all the challenges that require international cooperation. I mean, climate change is the perfect example. No single nation can solve that on its own. We need countries to collaborate, not compete, to address those really complex issues.
It's almost ironic. These leaders came to power by using social media, which is like it's an incredibly interconnected technology. And yet the policies they're pushing seem to be moving us toward a world that's a lot more disconnected.
That's a really interesting point, and it makes you wonder, can social media be a tool to promote global cooperation and understanding? Or will it continue to be used to amplify division and nationalism?
It's like a double-edged sword, right? On the one hand, social media can connect people across borders, across cultures. But on the other hand, it can also be used to spread misinformation and reinforce these echo chambers. And that makes it even harder to find common ground.
Exactly. And the paper doesn't really offer any easy answers, but it does highlight just how important critical thinking is and media literacy, especially in this new digital age. We can't just passively consume information. We have to question it, analyze it, and then engage in constructive dialogue with people who might have different viewpoints.
So it's not just about being aware of the information we consume, it's also about how we engage with it and the conversations we have online. It's about breaking out of those echo chambers and seeking out those different perspectives.
Exactly. It's about recognizing how powerful these platforms are and using them responsibly to try and foster understanding and bridge those divides, not to make them wider.
You mentioned before that these leaders were really good at tapping into people's anxieties and frustrations. Do you think addressing those underlying issues is really the key to countering the appeal of the far right?
Well, the paper seems to think so. It argues that just countering the rhetoric of the far right isn't really enough. We need to understand what's causing this discontent. What are those economic anxieties? What are those social frustrations? That political disillusionment that allowed these leaders to connect with so many voters.
So it's about creating a world where people feel heard, where they feel represented, where they have a sense of agency and hope for the future, instead of resorting to fear and division.
Exactly. It's about addressing the issues that create inequality, marginalization, and this sense of hopelessness. It's about building a more just and equitable and inclusive society where everyone has a chance to thrive.
That sounds like a pretty tall order, especially in a world that feels so polarized and divided.
It's definitely a challenge, there's no doubt. But the paper argues that it's a challenge we have to confront. It's about recognizing our shared humanity and working together to create a world where cooperation and understanding and compassion are the guiding principles, not fear, division, and self-interest.
Feels like we've uncovered a lot here today. I mean, we've gone from slogans to social media strategies to this whole idea of competitive nationalism. It's a lot to process. So where do we go from here? I mean, what does this all mean for us, for the average person?
Yeah, that's the big question, isn't it? The paper doesn't, offer any easy solutions, but it definitely leaves us with some pretty powerful insights, I think. You were just mentioning social media strategies, and the paper really emphasizes that we can't underestimate how much influence those platforms have on shaping political discourse. We've got to be really savvy consumers of information, and we need to find ways to use these platforms to promote a more positive and inclusive vision, I think, for the future.
It's like we need to develop a whole new set of skills just to navigate, this whole digital world. The paper uses the term media literacy and talks about the importance of critical thinking.
Right, exactly. I mean, think about it. We are just bombarded with information constantly, right? But how do we actually sift through all of it? How do we determine what's credible, what's biased, what's just, designed to manipulate our emotions? That's where media literacy and critical thinking come in. We have to be able to analyze information. We have to evaluate the sources, and we have to be able to recognize, persuasive techniques and all of that.
That makes me think about education. Is this something that needs to be taught from a young age? I mean,
Yeah.
it feels like these skills are essential, not just for navigating, the political world,
Mhm.
but just for navigating the world today, period.
I totally agree with that. The paper actually argues that education is really key here. We need to give future generations the tools they need to think critically, to be more discerning about the information they're taking in, and to be able to engage in, constructive dialogue, especially online.
But it's not just about young people, is it? It feels like we all need to take a step back
Hmm.
and really reevaluate how we're engaging with information. Especially on social media, it's just so easy to get caught up in these echo chambers
Hmm.
where our own biases are just, constantly being reinforced.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. We can't just, sit back and passively consume information. We need to actively seek out, different perspectives. We need to challenge our own assumptions and be willing to, engage in respectful dialogue, even with people that we disagree with.
So it's not just about being aware of the problem. It's about taking action too, both individually and collectively.
Yeah, absolutely. We can't just sit back and hope things are going to, magically get better. We all need to participate in the political process. We have to hold our elected officials accountable and really engage in our communities, volunteer our time, support organizations that share our values, and use our voices to advocate for change.
I think this deep dive has really been eye-opening. It's definitely highlighted a lot of challenges that we're all facing, but
Yeah.
it's also given me a sense of hope,
Yeah.
that we can create a better future, even with all these really complex global trends happening.
Me too. I think the paper reminds us that the future isn't, it isn't set in stone. It's up to us to decide what kind of world we want to live in and to work together to make that vision a reality.
That's a great point. And all of our listeners out there, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the rise of the far right. We've covered a lot of ground today, from those nationalistic slogans to the role of social media, to the dangers of competitor nationalism and all of that. But I think the most important thing we've talked about is how we can navigate all of these challenges, how to be more informed and engaged citizens, and how we can all work together to create a more inclusive, collaborative, and hopeful future. Until next time, keep diving deep.